Poland is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Our program, Poland Today, will bring together the people who choose to come to Poland and many who have already made their mark here. Now, they will share their insight on some of the biggest news stories and give their impressions of this dynamic country. Join me, David Kennedy, each week on Poland Today. Poland Today is pleased to host Tony Housh, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre and principal at the consulting firm CGC Advisors. And Tony has seen great changes in the country over the past 3 decades. Now, Tony, there's a lot to cover, but maybe best start with recent things that have been happening. The tariffs on exporters. What can we unpick from the news from the last couple of weeks?
Well, I think the big news, David, is that the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the Trump administration's tariff package, and that has made the administration move back to using previously available legal mechanisms. After that was struck down, the president said 10% universal tariffs, then he said 15% universal tariffs, and I think there's some concern that these came out of the blue.
Okay, and it didn't come out of the blue?
No, they did not. And I think that, there are pre-existing authorizations for any president. I think with the 15% tariff, he's going back to the 1974 Trade Act, which multiple administrations have used over the years. Some things might be covered under the Section 301, what they call Discriminatory Practices Act to rectify things. Other areas might be covered under the Section 232 National Security. But I think it is important for people to realize, whether you're a fan of a decision or not, that these are based on long existing mechanisms available to any administration. So while there is a sincere hope that the U.S.-Poland agreement discussed last summer and not yet ratified, will hold, I think it is important that people do keep in mind that these are not arbitrary mechanisms that are unenforceable, that they are based on law. And it's also important to remember, I think, as we discussed prior to starting on air, that some of this authority only runs 150 days at a time. Okay,
so 150 days, that will bring us up basically to the end of June.
For some of these areas as well. Yeah, some that are on the unfair competition side or national security side have longer windows. But I think that, this is going to be an evolving situation as we've seen over the last few months. So I think the best people can do is hope that people will focus on what's best for the transatlantic economic relationship as the largest trade and investment relationship in the world.
Well, exactly. Poland is growing its trade with the United States, becoming an even more significant partner. Now, over the last year or so, have exporters maybe been coming to you and saying, well, where do we go on these tariffs? Or are people basically looking at a longer perspective and thinking, right, well, we've got our margins and we can sweat this out?
Well, I can't speak for, of course, the market as a whole, but from the companies that I've worked with and talked to, most of them taking a longer term perspective, thinking about what is their place in the North American market for their products or their services. And it's also important to remember that when we look at impact, some of the impact does not necessarily immediately affect to Polish producers exporting to the U.S. because they're part of supply chains which are going through the Germany, Netherlands, other markets as the country of origin for whatever that export to the United States is. Okay. So it's not always necessarily that a Polish exporter is being hit directly with that tariff impact.
Okay, so say for example, I make rivets here, then that might go to Belgium or France or Germany, and then become part of another product, and it will be that product which would then be hit by tariffs.
Yeah, and so in some, but not all cases, by simply staying in the single market and selling into global supply chains, there may not be an immediate direct impact on the Polish producer. However, it is important to keep in mind that things do filter through eventually,
Yes.
even if you don't have that immediate impact at the very beginning. But of course, for direct exports, to the U.S., uncertainty can be an issue. I think one thing that has certainly made for many markets in Europe has lessened that a little bit is the fact that the dollar to euro or dollar to zloty FX rate, has been trending in the right way to, in some cases, to bring benefit and lessen the impact of tariffs. However,
right. So by that you mean that it's been trending in the direction of going down against the zloty. The zloty's been very high.
Yes. I think that that can work as a tariff mitigation, but it can also increase, of course, costs and then the price point on issues can be. But what's I think critical with the tariffs thing is to keep in mind, tariffs have been used in various ways by many administrations, and I think business for the most part wants to see, first of all, stability, predictability, and to be able to make plans, accordingly without the back and forth pendulum constantly going.
Okay, so in that regard, in terms of Poland's exports to the US, then things are going well. Now, when people think of exports, they very often think of, as we said, the rivets, etc. But that's not the kind of the fundamentals at the moment of the growth in the relations between Poland and the United States. There's this whole area of business services where there's been massive growth. And what's been behind that?
Well, I think I would put that into two baskets. You have the export of services and technology and business services from Poland to the U.S., by a whole range of companies and sectors. And then you have the massive growth over the last decade of global business services based in Poland, okay. Which is providing significant employment, hundreds of thousands of people working in the sector, in increasingly high-value jobs, many of those for U.S. companies, but also other global entities. And this is also services being re-exported in many cases that go into this balance of trade on goods and services. And I think this is one of the almost hidden areas in the economy, looking at how many people are employed, looking at the increasingly higher range of value added, where now it's fund management, analytics, significant, mid-bank opportunities that are being taken care of, here in Poland.
So it might have started at data entry and call centers or something like that, but it's grown and become much more sophisticated.
Absolutely. It is very sophisticated, and many of these operations run 24/7, and they are integral not only to the operations of multinational companies, but in some cases, the ability of those companies to support their client base. So in whether it be in banking or engineering services or other things, it's not just internal servicing that they're doing, but they're supporting projects, that are ongoing 24/7 around the world. And I think it's a area that is a place where Poland has been able to utilize its tremendous positives in terms of the skill of the labor force, the education of the labor force, particularly in finance, in IT, systems management, as well as the business side of that, in financial services and internal company operations. So this is a case where I think the global market met a great market for being able to provide that. Then I think the challenge is to continue to be upskilling within that.
Of course, and we hope that that upskilling continues. People are looking for ways of saving their money, cutting back on expenses, bringing in AI. Is this potentially a risk now for this big sector? I mean, we're talking about at the moment some 300, 400,000 people who are employed in that. Will it be like what we've seen, for example, in the coal mining sector, that suddenly we have these areas like Krakow and Wrocław where there's a lot of employment there? Could some of those jobs end up going?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly what's going to happen with AI.
No.
But I do think that the more you can upskill within the market, within the operations, within your geography, the better insulated you're going to be to at least near and medium term inroads from AI taking jobs. AI is initially going to, I think, it's going to take jobs which don't require significant experience, which don't require significant decision-making skills, and don't require looking at causal connectivity effects of actions. Now, so AI will certainly impact the GBS sector, but I think that Poland is much better placed and on the trajectory it is to be more resilient because of the skill sets and the value added that it's providing in there. But I think, AI is going to impact every sector. We just don't know perhaps in exactly which way.
Well, exactly. And one aspect of AI is, of course, who's steering AI, and many of the American companies are definitely the ones who are in charge here. Is there likely to be a kind of an imbalance because of their preponderance here, or are Polish companies also coming into the market of AI? We think of it as this AI, alien intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly if you look at big language models and the very large platforms, there's a significant preponderance of large American technology platforms on that. But within this AI universe, I mean, to the extent I'm able to get my head around it and work with it in my business, there's a tremendous opportunity to provide specific technologies and tools to help shape how that bigger AI model is used. And when you see this happening, I see a number of companies here, in Warsaw, or companies with Polish roots that are working on certain language models and certain tools, in their areas of business, where they're not trying to reinvent the wheel, of a chat GPT or something like that, but saying, how do we take this tool set and provide, a value-added mechanism for people in this sector or for people with these particular needs. And this is something that I think Polish companies are doing well, and I think we're going to see more of that. And then when you look at, just background-wise as well, it's not a bad advertisement for Polish entrepreneurs, in AI, to see like 11 Labs, raising money and having global, platforms. But I think there's, aside from the high-end, highly visible programs like that, as I said, I have worked with a number of companies and see what they're doing in a range of areas, from virtual reality, augmented reality, defense applications, border security applications, data mining. So I think there's tremendous opportunity in AI. I think for Poland, AI and, interestingly, space are two areas where Polish intellectual capital has tremendous opportunity to provide a successful business model.
Now, space is very much in the news, of course, with the Artemis 2 mission to the moon. When you mention Polish space technology, probably most people in the United States have no idea of some kind of Polish contribution to this. What kind of things are happening in that area?
Well, I think, we've already had, Polish systems and experiments, going on the recent probe to the sun. We've had Polish excavator and driller on the surface of Mars. We continue to, see Poland have success, microsatellites, cube satellites, and various technologies. And I think that it's also important to think about the space sector is not just about a big rocket going up into space, but it's how do you capture, utilize, and bring benefit to society from all the data that can be mined and be available to the type of sensor platforms. You can use that for national security, for communications, for groundwater monitoring, all these sort of things that Polish companies are doing very well in, and I think increasingly finding more partnerships, both at the NASA level, both at the European Space Agency level, as well as looking at ways to use private platforms to get Polish assets into space to be used for both national as well as business needs.
At the moment, it looks almost like a two-horse race in space, the Chinese against the Americans. And much of the technology, even in the American effort, much of it is actually sourced from China. Where is that sweet spot for Poland that we can really exist there long term?
I think it is, as in AI, as in other areas, it's in doing things better, more efficiently, and smarter, finding solutions to challenges, creating tools that achieve something that is needed and necessary. And I think this is where Polish entrepreneurs in the space sector have been very focused on looking at where there are shortcomings in the market between, a handful of global players and international players, say in the certain satellite market, but for many people and countries that have specific needs and users, be they national governments, be they companies, be they security services and armed forces, they have specific needs at specific price points and on specific timelines. Do I want capability X available to me in 24 months, or do I want maybe X squared, but it's not available to me for 7 years because of the lead time, build time, launch time? So I think that companies, not just in Poland, but in the US as well, are looking at how do we deliver needed science, information, and assets today. And that's where I think the sweet spot is for Poland.
That's where the sweet spot is for Poland. Also, I suppose there's always a security element. We hear an awful lot about nearshoring. But is much of that happening, this idea of bringing things back from the Far East and sourcing things in other markets, in friendly markets? Is this benefiting Poland, or is it other Asian countries rather than Polish markets, for example, that are benefiting?
Well, I think one of the key things to keep in mind is that the nearshoring trend and strategies being implemented post pandemic disruption, these are longer term strategies. Certain things could be done quickly in terms of nearshoring. However, it's important to remember that as private sector companies do this, they also have to make sure that their investment decisions to reallocate resources and redistribute production of key elements has to be acceptable to shareholders, has to be acceptable to the P&L of the company. And unless there is a concerted program by a national government to support some of these efforts, then it's going to happen at the pace in which business can accommodate it. But I think it is happening. I think also nearshoring will not necessarily be bringing everything, say, back to Europe or to the US, but perhaps to other OECD countries or other countries that are deemed to be safe geographies, that are less prone to political disruption, transport disruption. And so I think that there's enough benefit from the overall nearshoring trend that Poland and certainly Central Europe will continue to benefit, but it will not be a tsunami. It will be more of just rising levels over time.
Now, in terms of that kind of technology and innovation, the US has always been so good at coming up with the ideas, but I mean, Europe has come up with the ideas as well, but financing those ideas, bringing them to fruition, encouraging investors to come on board. How can we do more of that? What is it that US investors want to see more of in this part of the world?
There is no doubt that in terms of intellectual creativity, that Europe creates a tremendous amount of new technology, of new ideas. I think the difference is speed to market in terms of commercializing these visionary developments. And I think that it goes back to, in my view, one of the key elements is the single market is not yet done.
Single market's not yet done. What do you mean by that?
And by that, I mean, we've seen, for instance, the Draghi report talking about competitiveness and all of this. But I think equally important is the report by Enrico Letta, the former Italian prime minister, which came out more or less concurrently, which talks about the single market exercise and saying, looking at issues that we have trillions and trillions of euro locked into pension savings that are not utilized in the same way as the U.S. pension funds are used on the capital markets to finance growth.
This 401k kind of idea, or just, even just the structure of what they're allowed to invest in?
What they can invest in, and so nobody's necessarily saying gamble with all of the money, but even a few trillion conservatively managed to support innovation, to support growth of champions with European technology, European platforms could certainly be useful. But also, we still do not truly have a single market in energy and financial services. So we have a number of regulations and directives which allow cross-border things to happen. But if we truly want to scale and be competitive, for instance, in one of the biggest challenges for European economy, which is energy pricing, if we truly want to do that, if we had a single market, a true single market for energy, overall, I think it would be more beneficial to consumers. It'd be more beneficial to business, to make Europe more competitive, to maintain its tremendous world-class advanced manufacturing base. And this is where I think we're also, it's a unique time to do that because we're also transitioning globally in fuel use and energy mix. And so I think that Europe has made some choices with regard to green energy, which move in the right direction from a long-term point of view. But you also have to think about how do you transition so that economies are protected, so that economic prosperity is not potentially injured, or more importantly, limited by, say, high costs or unreliability of power. So this is an area where I think that is critically important. And this is an area where I think Poland, by moving into both baseload nuclear as well as the SMR space, expanding its LNG capability to use natural gas as a transition fuel, but also to supply much needed energy to neighbors. Poland is making a lot of the right decisions, and it has been over the last decade.
Well, of course, Poland has made many correct decisions over the past decade. It's had, in many ways, to make those decisions because it was completely reliant on trade with Russia. But a pipeline gas coming through, pipeline oil coming through, as well as that massive imports of coal from Russia and from markets controlled by Russia. That's had to change. And now, of course, we have a new big guy in town in terms of Poland's energy mix. It is the US. Is that a good thing always? I mean, you might look at one partner and another and say, well, I'd rather have that partner than that one. But keeping that mix is always going to be important, isn't it?
Yes, but I think there have been a few voices, including at the Commission, that have raised this idea of, have we simply transitioned from Russian gas to American gas? Well, the difference is Russian gas, state-controlled, Gazprom-controlled. American gas is a very competitive market with multiple major global and sub-global players that are going to compete against each other
to get the best,
to get deals to sell to Poland, to anybody else in Europe, and that's going to be done at global market prices. And the global market pricing is going to dictate what those prices are, not someone sitting in
the Kremlin.
Yes, your word, not mine. But yes, indeed. So I think this is. I understand the optic perception, but when you look at, for instance, Poland, I think right now Poland gets U.S. LNG from no less than 3 different suppliers in the U.S. alone. Mm-hmm. Plus, of course, there's options to acquire LNG from other markets as well.
But set up at kind of semi-fixed pricing, and the pricing was quite good for the US when it was set up. I mean, it'll have to be renegotiated at a certain time, but it's a good deal for the US.
Well, it's a good deal for the US, but again, the US doesn't set gas prices. The global market sets gas prices. So whether it's at the Henry Hub, exporting out of the U.S. or in other markets, that is set. I think one of the key things is to make sure that European importers in certain parts of Europe don't apply the maximum pricing that the Commission allows them, but actually passes on the U.S. or international market price to their customers.
Okay, that's very important. At the same time, I mean, the Russian pipelines were simply, they were taken over by Polish companies, but at any point, I mean, they're beautifully maintained. Still, you could still turn the gas back on at some stage. Is that something that is? Do you think you're living in Poland, just like me. After all these years, we think of Poland as we for a lot of the time. Is that something that you could imagine seeing?
It's very difficult for me to imagine seeing that now. Will potentially at some point in the future Russian molecules return to the wider international market outside of the shadow fleet and pipelines to China?
Of which there's quite a lot.
Yeah. Perhaps, but I think in the near term, I don't see the European Union reversing course on Russian energy molecules, particularly for gas, anytime soon. I think that for Poland, for our Baltic neighbors, for many of our European friends, have been on the end of that. We'll turn the pipe off, we'll turn the pipe on, we'll threaten you with this, we'll threaten you with that. And in some cases, Poland being charged more than other markets for gas, where I think, Poland and all of Central Europe in particular is much better off focusing on the ability to acquire gas on the global market, to acquire oil on the global market. And while nobody can exactly control pricing, rather than have it be based on the political decision of a particular source or neighbor. But I think that the likelihood of Russian gas coming back in any scale in the near term, I'd say, is relatively low.
Is relatively low. Now, but something that's been, it was part of the Polish landscape for so long. You've been here now for, as long as me, not quite as long as me. I came 94. When did you first come here?
93.
93, but you went away back at one stage, yeah?
Except I was mostly working at the Polish Ministry of Finance. Just my job was technically someplace else.
All right. Okay. So 1993. Now, if we kind of take a step back from the sort of the top news stories and just think of that period and all of the things that have changed over that time. What would you say was the kind of the pivot point in terms of Polish growth?
Well, I think Polish growth kind of snuck up on people because I think even in the mid-90s, as Poland already hit 5-6% growth, there was still enough turbulence. A lot of people didn't see it or feel it yet. You knew there was a lot of stuff happening, but economic statistics didn't mean quite so much because it was still a very dynamic churn. I think that the pivot point, both for investments, but politics, global engagement, perception, was 1999.
1999.
Poland's accession to NATO was such a rapid change in the course of a decade, from a Warsaw Pact country to a member of NATO, to having secured its democracy and its public institutions to a point where NATO and the United States said yes to membership.
Okay, and so what did that trigger in terms of the Polish economy then?
What that triggered for many people, and I still have a quote framed that was I made back in 1999, said it was an ISO certificate for international investors. Poland had crossed a threshold to feel that its state institutions, its rule of law, its direction warranted acceptance into the most successful security alliance in history, that was a marker and a critical milestone on the way to EU accession. And so while it's not directly economically linked, for many investors who might have been considering Poland and that class of 1999 as possible places to go, it was definitely a major seal of approval that Poland was no longer on the outside looking in, but had made its first step into the real club of global democratic free market countries.
Okay, so a kind of a psychological barrier for investors that
absolutely
that they. I suppose there's always that kind of that nuclear question of what is going to happen if, and so Poland being in NATO guaranteed essentially that Poland was safe.
Well, Poland was safe, secure, and had been kind of given its stamp of approval by the club of Western democratic nations. And so that was, I think, an important psychological step. But it also validated those ambassadors of investment from the 1990s who, early on, when some of the early players came in, whether it was, Citibank, PepsiCo, International Paper, some of their peers throughout, the OECD world thought, wow, that's pretty bold, going in, to make these major investments in privatizations and acquire assets. But I think that validated already those companies, they're showing success, and other companies, of course, as well. But I think that then hitting that NATO membership and seeing that Poland was well on the way to adopting the acquis communautaire and moving toward the '04 accession to the EU, was all part of a very important momentum to let investors realize that there's tremendous opportunity here, and multiple litmus tests have been met.
Yes, well, that's fascinating, actually. So even more so than accession to the EU, that was the turning point. That's fascinating. And of course now, well, that was 1999. 2022, was there a payoff? And is that still paying off for Poland? Are we still safe?
I think Poland is safe, and Poland will continue to be safe.
And what guarantees that?
What guarantees
America?
that? Well, I think certainly, as the U.S. administration has said, Article 5 remains in place. That there's no question, about Article 5. But I think also NATO today is a more certainly cohesive and, frankly, combat-focused, deterrence-focused force than perhaps during the peace dividend years.
Yeah.
When everyone thought we could spend less and draw down. Poland, certainly was one of the early movers from the Crimea invasion in 2014 that was already moving to modernize its armed forces. But the 2014 invasion made critical decisions easier to implement. And I think since that time, Poland has shown that one does not modernize and rebuild deterrence capability overnight, so that it's a long-term process. And frankly, I've had multiple conversations from my work in the defense industry with companies and countries throughout the region who say we wish we had begun our journey when Poland did, because now we are kind of racing to catch up. But I think that Poland now, reinforced by Finnish and Swedish NATO membership, with close partnership throughout the Baltic Basin, as well as with our Baltic nation partners, I think Poland is secure, and I think that dividend of 1999 is showing to have been one of the best investments the country could have made.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned a few big American names there that have been successful here, banks, paper companies, etc., etc. But over this period, if you were to look at, stars, if you were to look at, a great story of success in the Polish economy. You've got a million anecdotes of things going right. What would you point to?
Well, David, your show is far too short to talk about the number of tremendous success stories and long-term success stories. But just to suggest, a few in varying sectors about and the tremendous impact that they're having. For instance, if we look at the development not only of business within Poland and employment, but also the role that companies like Google and Amazon are playing in the development of the Polish cloud, which has business support, government support and continuity, as well as national security issues. So, that's a tremendous ongoing project there. American investment in the aviation sector, here has been, tremendous, which means that today, Pratt & Whitney here, which is now part of Raytheon Technologies, not only are they, the largest employer in the aviation sector in Central Europe, but the fact that they're bringing Polish-made components and elements to global supply chains, including the F-35 and a whole range of advanced systems. And then again, when we look at long-term investments, you have PZL Mielec, which is part of Lockheed Martin today. Exporting Black Hawk helicopters around the world, and including to Los Angeles County. So when you see on TV Black Hawks dropping water on wildfires in LA County, they're made in Poland. So this shows how this role into global supply chains is important. But there's also a significant amount of companies that have multiple production facilities, multiple R&D facilities throughout Poland here. And in some cases, I get in trouble if I start naming certain companies just because I'll leave others out. But if you look at certain companies, whether it's a General Electric or a 3M or others, where, they have multiple facilities, here in Poland, where Poland is a critical part of its global business enterprise. And, and we talked about GBS, Global Business Services, but also, when you have a whole range of leading American banks having significant operations here that are critical to how that bank operates 24/7 around the world. So I think that this is something where it's hard to underestimate that it's not just about the quantity of the investment, but I think for the U.S. here in Poland, but the faith and the belief in the market by the fact that, this is sustained investment and, most importantly, reinvestment. For many of the U.S. companies, I know from my time as a board member, at the American Chamber, that over half of U.S. companies reinvest each and every year. So it's not just asking for more investment,
get the money and run kind of thing,
but continuing to reinvest, continuing to grow their businesses here, because it's not just about the Polish market. It's about the fact that Poland is a fantastic platform to utilize, tremendous talent, to build value and grow. And I think one of the other things that I think we've discussed in the past, David, is that the amount of entrepreneurial efforts that spin off of these research and development centers, these shared services centers, these industrial production, this is also a tremendous benefit because that entrepreneurial idea that I can do this better or more agile, or I have an idea how to serve this market. And so there's been a vast range of companies which have actually had their roots in these long-term American investments.
Okay, so that American long-term view of Poland has been very, very important. And with R&D and with innovation, we've also seen the emergence of tremendous Polish talents. You have been here when the Democrats have been in power, when the Republicans have been in power, when in Poland there was Kwaśniewski was president. Of course, we've had law and justice here. We've had the Tusk government as well. Can you think of key figures whose vision for Poland has really impressed you over that time?
Well, boy, you're going to put me into political space there, which I'll try to avoid. I think what I would put it a different way. What I think is remarkable in Poland is, despite the obvious political competition between different visions of how to govern and what priorities should be, is going back to the early 90s, from the earliest days when we were here, a cross-party, cross-ideological understanding that Poland is, as Słowacki said, the heart of Europe. It needs to do what it needs in order to be secure, in order to find economic success. And I think that the unanimity in moving toward NATO membership, the unanimity in implementing the acquis and moving toward EU accession, the unanimity in responding to crises, be it the pandemic, be it the Russian aggression against Ukraine, I think show that there is a incredibly important shared purpose of a secure, prosperous Poland. And that does not mean there's not political fighting around many, many areas of it. But I think that Poland has benefited by the fact that we literally have a multi-generational idea that, Poland's future is in a free, prosperous Europe that is secure, and largely almost every major policy and decision, whether it be about security and defense or foreign affairs, has moved Poland in that direction, regardless of who's been in the government.
Of course. And whenever there's been a question of relations between the US and Poland, you've been there. The people who come over, they've asked Tony what has been important over that time. Is there, say, one person that you could point to who had a real innovative vision?
One person among a number that I think was quite interesting is that when certain people began to talk in the mid-90s about the idea of Poland and a few of its neighbors potentially joining NATO in some point in the near future. You take some people like Dan Freed, the former U.S. ambassador here, of course, also former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. When Dan and some of his colleagues, around the National Security Council and the Department of State, I think, started to raise this idea, it was perhaps a visionary would not have been the word some people would have used, because of where Poland had been just a few years before, both economically, but in terms of, this early transition. And so I think that is where seeing the promise and the possibility of Poland and Central Europe, it required some big thinking. And not simply looking at current economic statistics or recent history, but what is possible, and looking at the broader historical sweep. And I think this was this sort of thinking, and it was also, I think, mirrored on the Polish side across the ideological spectrum. Mm-hmm. That to think big,
which was different in those days anyway.
Absolutely,
yes,
but this again back to this idea that there was this unanimity to think big. To see that Poland's rightful place was in the security alliance, in a more integrated, economically viable structure for Europe. And so I think that this was, Poland benefited in the 90s from both American, but certainly Polish, big thinking.
Can I ask you, what did he say? Do you remember one conversation?
Just many people were looking at what had been recently rather than what could be.
Okay.
And I think this is very often whether we're in business or policy making, very often we stand at that, kind of at the top of the roof line, and you can either look at what has been or what can be, and which way to lean. And you can either make the conservative choice of, we better not, or we better go slow because recent history is not so great, or to be more ambitious or to be more forward leaning. And I think this is where in that critical time in the 1990s, there was a sufficient group of people on the US side that advocated support and help for Poland and the new democracies. And here, also in Poland and in the region, that had aspiration. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, fortuitously, those two streams converged. Because had one stream gone a different way, we could be living in a somewhat different, maybe less ambitious, less integrated Central Europe.
Very, very interesting. And so we'll say on the American side, Dan Frey, former ambassador at that time, and that crucial time, just when in the discussions about Poland's future. And you're being rather coy about going into the Polish side, but give me somebody who has maybe been throughout that time, maybe a little bit of a mentor for you, or somebody that you have really looked at on the Polish side, not even necessarily a politician.
Well, I think again, David, you're putting me on the spot here because again, it comes down to if I mention person A or B, then I'm leaving out C and D. Let me put it this way: I have been very fortunate to spend a lot of time with and speak with people from across the political spectrum, and ultimately, one of the things that has struck me by those discussions has been when you strip away everything, that very often there's been a pleasantly discovered idea that most of these policy leaders, political leaders, want to do what they feel is the right thing for Poland. And I think in some cases, I have been very humbled to hear and see, people divert focus and attention from themselves to the goal and the purpose. And frankly, I think around the world, while it may not happen every day, I think I've seen it happen here more than I might have in other markets. And again, nothing takes the place of the good old rough and tumble world of politics and back and forth. But I think that to me, that has been one of the most uplifting things about all my time here in Poland is, when push comes to shove, generally people wanting to do the right thing. And I say that as a political class, I think speaks to the shared history. It speaks to the kind of national aspiration. And also I think it speaks to national pride over personal benefit.
Right.
At times. And I think that Poland has been well served by this kind of common vision of where Poland needs to go. Now, exactly how it looks when it gets there, that will be up to the politics of the day.
Of course. I mean, we saw that kind of response when there was an attack on Ukraine the main attack on Ukraine by Russia. The whole country reacted and did the right thing. People took Ukrainians into their homes. There were many decisions which were made very quickly. Yes. And we were talking about pivotal moments, then that was maybe a pivotal moment as well. But
I think you're absolutely right. The national response by both public authorities, but most importantly by civil society in February 22, was remarkable. And I think that is something that has certainly shaped the view of Poland around the world, as well as its economic success story. But also the ability of the country, to mobilize. But I think that one of the key things too, I think, is that I would say, as I travel back and forth to Washington a great deal, when people are visiting Warsaw or other parts of Poland, from DC, but also from our European allies and partners, our Canadian friends and others, Poland is in a unique time, I think, in its history, where it is seen as a success story. It is seen as a resolute partner. It is seen as a place that is great to invest. And it is seen largely as a country that is able to maintain relationships with a range of allies and partners, despite administrations and governments changing. So I think that this, to me, is part of the success story, in Poland, and I hope it has generations and generations to run. But I think that sometimes we do for those of us who've been here a long time and our Polish compatriots, need to take a step back and really look at the tremendous arc of growth and success that Poland has had since 1989. And sometimes when I step back and I look at it and think about all these various milestones and the people, it's been a remarkable journey.
Well, Tony, it's a remarkable journey. Your life has been a remarkable journey. Throughout the years, it's always been a pleasure talking to you. We have talked over tables like this. We've talked by the football field. I always enjoy having you, and thanks very much for being my guest today on Poland Today.
My great pleasure, David.
Great to see you. And what can I add to that conversation? As you know, Tony is a great person to listen to. I'm really pleased that he's been my first guest here on Poland Today. That's all from me, David Kennedy, here on Poland Today. Thank you very much.